Is the Iranian nuclear program really dead? After all, the Iranians have received blow after blow from Israel and also a very strong attack from the United States. But questions remain. Is the program really over? Shalom and welcome to another episode of Israel Undiplomatic. I'm Mark Regev and I'm here at the JNS studios in Jerusalem, and I'm joined by my co-host, Ruthie Blum, who once again is speaking to us from New York City. How are you today, Ruthie?
Well, good and bad. I mean, obviously, there's big news about the ceasefire, or so-called ceasefire, between Israel and Iran. And another big news story for Israelis and Jews all over the world is the victory in the New York City Democratic Party primary of an anti-Semite and a communist.
So, Ruthie, we'll have time to discuss all that, and I want to discuss Gaza too. But let's start with the really big news, which is the ceasefire that President Trump declared yesterday to end the 12-day war, as he put it, between Israel and Iran. And the question is, how should we feel? Is this good? Is this bad? I can tell you what was good for me personally is that for the first time in 12 days, I had a good night's sleep, that me and millions of other Israelis weren't woken up in the middle of the night by some siren going off and being told that we have to run to our shelters so that we'll be safe from incoming rockets. So it was a pleasure to get a good night's sleep, but that's in itself not important. What's important is the way this has turned out. Good for America, good for Israel.
Okay, so my initial reaction, as you know me well, was to say, uh-oh, this isn't good. Uh-oh, we're stopping the campaign before we're really done. And then on second thought, I reminded myself to take my own advice and take a deep breath before judging. And now I've completely come around to the other side, which is to say that now we know that whatever happens, if Iran pulls any more stunts, we are prepared to resume battling them, just as we have been doing with Hezbollah in Lebanon after the ceasefire. And the thing about Iran is we were actually surprised at how weak it is compared to what we thought, and the fear that, if we launch a real attack on Iran, that there'll be hundreds of thousands of dead Israelis. Well, that was far from the truth. And in fact, we accomplished a lot of strategic victories in Iran with U.S. help, of course. So I now am completely optimistic about it because now I trust Prime Minister Netanyahu to be on the ball. We have tons of intelligence there, and we will be warned and we will know if Iran has any more movement that we cannot permit.
There was a Chinese communist leader called Mao Zedong, a terrible mass murderer. But he famously or infamously called the United States a paper tiger. In other words, it might growl like a tiger, but it says, it'll fall apart. It's like made of paper. And I think Iran, the Islamic regime of Iran, the what do they call themselves? The Islamic Republic, proved itself to be a paper tiger. That Israel had that air superiority even before the Americans got involved in offensive operations over Tehran, over their capital city, that we could hit any target that we wanted to in Iran without impunity, that we didn't have to worry about any Iranian proxy acting to supplement Iranian national strength. We didn't get missiles not from Lebanon and not from anywhere else. In other words, the fact that we were so predominant militarily, we exposed Iran for being weak. And I think we accomplished a lot of our goals. We seriously degraded Iran's nuclear program, and we can discuss that more in a moment. Did we totally eliminate it or not? That's an open question, I'm afraid. But did we seriously degrade their nuclear program? Unquestionably so, both physically in the attacks on the nuclear reactors done by Israel and then also by the United States, but by taking out all their scientific leadership. Those scientists who work on the Iranian bomb. It's like if you took all the people who were in the desert in New Mexico working on the Manhattan Project and you just killed them all, the project couldn't have gone forward. And we've managed to eliminate all these scientific leadership of the Iranian nuclear program. Crucial point. And if you combined the destruction to the manpower behind the program and the program itself, it really is, I'm sure, we've hit a significant blow on the nuclear program. And parallel to that, and the second goal operation was their missile program. Now, we saw how dangerous their missiles are. We saw unfortunately, I think it was more than 24, Ruthie. I think it was something close to 30 Israelis were killed in their homes from these incoming rockets. But if we'd allowed the Iranians to go forward, if we'd allowed the Iranians just to keep building these missiles more and more and more and more, it really would have been a huge threat to the population of the state of Israel. And the fact that we've managed to cut them down to size, and that we've destroyed a lot of their ability to launch these rockets against Israel, I think that's also terribly important. You put both of those things together, this is an Israeli victory with a capital V.
I agree with you totally. But I'd like to talk about President Trump for a moment. First of all, what was amazing is that in the lead up to the U.S. strike, it was in and out. The U.S. took out Fordo, Isfahan, and Natanz, and then came back, and President Trump posted on Truth Social, that's it, we're done. We did it. We're back home. Our pilots are safe. Now, why is that relevant? Because in the lead up to that strike, President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu were in total lockstep. They were faking out the media and there were no leaks or anything. And how we know it was a fake out is that President Trump was saying, within 2 weeks, I'll make a decision whether to join the war. And there were no leaks from the Israeli cabinet or from the U.S. administration. And everybody believed also right beforehand, there was a decoy B-2 stealth bombers sent to Guam while the real ones that were going to conduct the strike were on the way to Iran. It was beautiful. But then all of a sudden, and after all this great coordination, and after Trump again posted on Truth Social, it's over, there's a ceasefire, both sides wanted it. He got extremely testy with Israel. He even cursed at both Israel and Iran. They don't know what the F they're doing. And so a lot of people got nervous, rightly so, because what happened? Did Trump turn on Israel? But actually, I think he didn't. It's just Trump expressing, he says one thing and then he says another. Now he says he's proud of both sides. But more importantly, he's now involved in defending himself against what he calls the fake news, claiming that actually he didn't set back the nuclear program more than by a few weeks. And he's furious now, not so much at Israel or Iran. He's furious at the media and all the people claiming that basically the U.S. strike did very little. And I believe him and not them, because the point is Iran has been, as you point out, totally weakened on the one hand. And on the other hand, you and I both know that one false move and Israel will take action. So we now can breathe more easily, and not just because there aren't sirens and missiles coming in.
I'd add to that, Ruthie, that there was a double whammy. When Israel attacked Iran at the beginning of this round of fighting, we took them by surprise. And that's why we had overwhelming success on that first night of attacks, when we took out their leadership, their scientists, many of their targets. And then when a week or so later, America joined in, they also took them by surprise. And the Iranians were sitting there almost helpless. Now, it's not like they're a helpless baby. They were the neighborhood bullies, right? They were the ones exporting terrorism. They were the ones controlling Lebanon and Syria and Yemen. They were the ones who were this, But as I said before, to quote Mao Zedong, they were the paper tiger. They all fell apart. When they stood up to serious pressure, it just all fell apart from their side. We took them by surprise. We hit them with our technology. We hit them with our brave fighter pilots and our very, very effective Mossad agents. The Americans came in, they did their targeted strikes. And in the end, this is a win for the West. This is a win for the Arabs who also don't want to see Iran with a nuclear weapon. Huge, huge victory. And we are correct now. We have to see what happens from here. Because it's clear the Iranians have taken blows. And I'm sure the Iranian regime in the short term is going to be focusing on its own survival, because it's clear that the public of Iran are furious with this regime. And they were angry with the regime before the war. Think about how angry they're going to be now against the regime. Think of it, if you're an Iranian, right? This government has literally spent hundreds of billions of dollars that could have been spent on schools and hospitals and roads and so forth on this nuclear program. Not only was the nuclear program destroyed, and so the investment has been, largely been thrown in the dustbin, but what have they got from all this money spent that could have been spent, as I said, on much more other things that are good for the Iranian people? They got international isolation, they got sanctions that crippled their economy, and now they got a military strike on their capital, and they were shown to be defenseless. And so the Iranian people are justifiably furious with their regime, with their autocratic, theocratic regime. And maybe one of the consequences of this fighting, it might not happen immediately, but there are cracks there inside Iran. Now, I know regime change wasn't an overt goal articulated by either the United States or Israel, though hints were made that we'd prefer a different regime. Ultimately, though, that's a choice of the Iranian people. And maybe, dictatorships need to present to their people that they're all powerful, right? The fact that the terrible regime in Iran has been exposed as being weak, maybe that'll incentivize Iranians to say this is a time that we bring about a new form of government in our country.
By the way, you mentioned all the billions of dollars spent on the nuclear program, but you forgot to mention the billions of dollars spent on exporting terrorism around the globe. And as Israel knows all too well, with all its seven-front war with Iranian proxies that's still going on, by the way, and Israel is really taking out one by one, removing a lot of those threats, but it's not finished. Now, of course, Iran has declared victory, as Islamists always do. Whatever is going on, they declare victory, and they made a point of showing celebrations in the streets of Tehran. But we don't buy that. First of all, I don't think anybody, the Arab world certainly doesn't believe that Iran emerged victorious here. And also, the very fact that Iran says, okay, now we'll come to the table again, means that they basically are saying, please stop already and we'll negotiate. But let's make one thing clear about that. Any negotiation that doesn't involve a complete white flag from Iran is going to be pointless, useless. It'll be, if any deal is signed, if President Trump believes that any possible deal can be signed with Iran other than surrender, then Israel will, again, have to be at the ready to fight when necessary. And now the whole point is, now we see that it's possible and we can trust that it will be done. But again, like you mentioned that, we're still busy in Gaza, and we have to say also, tragically, yesterday 7 soldiers were killed there in the Strip, and it reminds us again and again that Iran was ahead of the octopus, but we still have Gaza to deal with. We still have 50 hostages left in the hands of Hamas. By the way, and the hostages are the only leverage left to Hamas, because otherwise it was completely finished. It would have been completely finished, and it basically is, other than the hostages. Now, Steve Witkoff, the Middle East envoy who has been negotiating this, claims yet again that we might be close to a deal. I'll believe that when I see it. I mean, how many times have you and I heard from Witkoff that we're close to a deal?
Well, before I jump into Gaza, because I don't want to talk about that, and of course the The deaths of the 7 soldiers yesterday afternoon that we learned about this morning is very sad, and the way they died is truly horrific. To be burnt to death inside an armored personnel carrier, an APC, is terrible. But I want to just go back 1 second to Iran and just say one last thing. This regime is hurt, and everyone in the West has to be aware that they could strike back through terrorism, because they've done that in the past. Until October 7th, the largest act of anti-Semitic murder since the Holocaust was the blowing up of the Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And that was done in the mid-1990s by the Iranians. And I think everyone should be aware that the Iranians still have a terror network throughout Europe and in the Americas too, and that they would try to do something to hit a target that they consider their enemies. It could be an Israeli target, it could be a Jewish target, it could just be an American target. I think the counter-terrorist community should be very vigilant, because if the Iranians want to strike back, especially if they're looking weak in front of their own people, maybe they need to have some accomplishment. And that would, to quote Churchill, this is the weak, underbelly, the terrorism around the world. Could they do something? And they could do it directly. They could do it through a proxy, Hezbollah, Hamas, someone like that. They could pay criminals to do something. The Iranians could be very resourceful, and I think we have to be careful that in the short term, we don't see some sort of Iranian-inspired terror attack. We've seen Iranian operatives, as I said, involved in all sorts of violent activity in Europe in the last few years. We could see them do something else here. On your issue of Gaza, which you raise, it's true, and you're right to be a touch cynical. People say, "Oh, we're close to a breakthrough in the talks with Hamas in Gaza to get hostages out for some sort of ceasefire, a temporary ceasefire." But let's be clear: there is maybe, Ruthie, a chance that we could actually be close to something real happening, and I'll explain why. Last time Israel took out one of Hamas's allies, that is Hezbollah, and Hamas felt they were alone and isolated, we actually did get a hostage deal. And we got a whole bunch of people out. And because Iran has been the major sponsor and supporter of Hamas all these years, right, with training and with diplomatic support and with finance and all that, the fact that Iran has been hit so hard, that means the coalition that supports Hamas has been hit so hard. So is it possible that in the next few days, we will see Hamas, not because they're nice people, but because they're under pressure, because they feel isolated, will they be ready to make concessions in these talks that'll make a deal possible? And I think there's a decent chance, you can't bank on it, but I think there's a decent chance that taking out Iran the way Israel and the United States have done can have positive blowback on the talks for releasing hostages.
No, definitely. And I hope that's the case. But here's my point. My point is that Hamas has no reason to want to make concessions, since the only thing it's got are the hostages. It has nothing else left. Okay, so whatever deal it's going to make, it'll be finished without the hostages. I was hoping that if there was going to be a ceasefire deal with Iran, that Iran one of the conditions should have been that Iran forces Hamas to free the hostages. Okay, that's my fantasy. And by the way, what you mentioned before about, we have to be vigilant about terrorism around the globe. You know something? Israelis have been suffering terrorism from the Islamic Republic for decades. And what's more, we're still, and American Jews have now seen what it's like to have these anti-Semitic attacks all over the place, and Europe as well. And don't forget that this argument you just made, what you just said was the argument that both the left in America and the woke right, like the Tucker Carlson camp, were using as a way of saying, let's not be dragged into a war by Israel, because we're going to then be victims of terrorist attacks. So, I want to say them really as though, you don't want to eliminate that threat, rather than, okay, let's cower in the face of those disgusting little despotic terrorists and say, no, 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 we're not going to help, as though this isn't in an American interest. So I would be careful about saying, okay, now they're going to retaliate with terrorism, as though they haven't been doing this all along.
So I think you might have misunderstood me. I wasn't saying we should cower and be scared. I said we should be prepared to meet the challenge. That's all I'm saying. I don't think we can let terrorists dictate the way we live. I don't think we can let terrorists decide our policy. I'm just saying this is a tool the Iranian regime could well use now that it's lost in the real war. It can try to have some sort of picturesque victory by having some successful terror attack somewhere around the world. That's all I was saying. And we do know, there were all these Israelis who were stranded in Cyprus because our airport was closed in Tel Aviv. It's now open, thankfully, but they were stranded there, and there was a report of out of Cyprus of a British national who was apparently recruited and paid for by the Iranians, who was going to commit terrorist attacks there in Cyprus against the Israelis who were stranded there. And so that they could do it in Cyprus, guess what? Cyprus is an EU country. They could do it in another 20 EU countries. This is the way these people operate. Why I say this, and it has to be said, Iran's not a normal country. Normal countries don't support terrorists. I think President Trump himself said a few days ago, this is the world's #1 state sponsor of terrorism. And that can never be forgotten. We're not talking about a normal country. We're not talking about a normal government. We're talking about a regime that is committed, in its own words, to the export of what they call the Islamic Revolution, which is the Khomeini-type ideology. And they are extremists, and they are bedfellows with Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis and all these people. And all I'm saying is the West has to be firm, the West has to be resolute, the West has to understand what we're up against.
Right. But something, what you just described has been, how many times we've thwarted such kinds of terrorist attacks in Europe against Israelis. And we're used to that. It happens again and again and again. And so you're talking about saying we have to be vigilant. Yes, we do. But guess what? I think this is a good segue to the conversation about who just won the New York City Democratic Party primary for mayor. And that is Zohran Mamdani, who is, may I say, it's not just that he's an Islamist and a communist. He's a progressive. He is one of the people. He said that if he's mayor and Netanyahu visits New York, he should be arrested. He is somebody who believes that aside from his communist policies with, free rent and whatever, forget about that for a moment. He is one of these people who supports from the river to the sea, Palestine must be free. He headed a chapter of Students for Justice in Palestine. This is a very dangerous guy. New York City is the biggest Jewish city in the world, a single city in the world. And if he becomes mayor, you're talking about we have to be vigilant. This guy is on the side of the terrorists.
Every year at the UN, they have the General Assembly in September, and world leaders come from all UN member states. I think it's something like 190 countries. And let's be frank, some of the people who come to these conferences represent regimes that are particularly despicable, particularly undemocratic, particularly brutal with the way they treat their own people. And you have various degrees of dictatorships, but let's be frank, there are more dictatorships out there than democracy. And for someone in the West to say, out of all these leaders who are coming to New York, I'm going to only arrest the leader of a democracy and of the Jewish state of Israel, which is, of course, in the democratic camp, that says something about their values. And that's why you have to ask them, is this just really about Israel, or is this about anti-Semitism? Because think of all those leaders who come from countries with atrocious human rights records, that butcher their own people, that imprison people in the middle of the night and lock them up without trial. There are countless countries like that. He's not talking about arresting anyone like that. He's talking about arresting the prime minister of a democratically elected government in a country with a free press and a free trade union movement. And for all our faults, we have many faults in Israel. But for someone to say, I'm singling out the prime minister of Israel, that means you're singling out the Jewish state. And what is your problem with the Jewish state? Maybe because precisely it's the state of the Jews.
Yeah, no kidding. Okay. The UN, that's a whole nother subject. We're talking about somebody who is likely to become the mayor of New York City. Can you believe that? But you know what? 70% of New Yorkers are Democrat, or registered voters are Democrats. And Jews always vote Democrat. Not always. But my point is that this guy is an open anti-Semite. I know you say, oh, Israel has many faults. You know what? That I hate to preface something by saying, of course, we understand criticism of Israel is allowed, criticism of the government is allowed. We don't need to preface this conversation by explaining that we acknowledge flaws. Oh, come on, everybody's flawed. Every country is flawed. We can say outright that it is outrageous for somebody to single out Israel, that means he's anti-Semitic. But in the case of Mamdani, it's not even a secret. He hates Israel. He's, what I'm saying is you don't even have to say, well, it's legitimate to criticize Israel. You know what? No, it's not. It's not legitimate to criticize Israel if, as you point out, you're not criticizing anybody else who's really violating human rights. All right. So that's all. I'm sick and tired of having to say we understand the people who criticize Israel. You know what? I don't.
So I also will always try to defend Israel against criticism. And there's a lot of criticism internally as well. We're a democracy and people have different approaches. But if we're talking about democracy, let me ask you a question. How is it that in American democracy, a person who's got these opinions can win the primary? What happened in New York? You're there, I'm here in Israel. Explain to me, as an Israeli in Israel, what happened in New York that a guy with this atrocious attitude towards the Jewish state can win the primary in a city that's full of Jews?
Well, you know what? That's why, because it's full of Jews. Let me tell you something. Do you know, as I moved to Israel almost 50 years ago, okay, so I'm not even a New Yorker anymore. I haven't been one since I was a teenager. But I can tell you one thing. When people ask me here, or when Trump supporters used to ask me, well, how is it that the American Jews are all vote Democrat? And how is it that any Israelis, for example, don't support Trump? And I'd say, well, Israel's a Jewish state. Because in this respect, Jews have lost their marbles.
But Ruthie, you're avoiding my question. You're avoiding my question because that they would vote in a Democratic primary for another Democrat, I understand. But why did they allow this particular Democrat to win the primary over other Democrats when he's so wrong on Jewish issues?
Wrong on Jewish issues? He's an enemy of the Jewish people.
So you make my question even stronger then.
Okay. So I'll tell you something. I don't have an answer to that other than that Jews are both smart and moronic in this respect. But I'll tell you something. One young woman was asked, a man in the street interview. And a young woman was asked why she supported Mamdani in this primary. And not Cuomo. Andrew Cuomo was running against him. And she said, well, Cuomo had allegations of sexual harassment, and I don't like that. So you know what? These progressive women and men, they all deserve each other. That's why it's true. He had some allegations of sexual harassment. Okay, I'm not happy about that either. But that was her answer. Okay. So when you ask me, how is that possible? It's possible because the progressive left has seeped into everybody's mind. There's young people here. Look at Columbia University. Look at all the New York universities. Thank God the Trump administration is trying to crack down on all of that it'll withhold funding from universities that are anti-Semitic. But if I don't say we, because I'm not a New Yorker, if New York ends up with this mayor, that means the total destruction of this great city.
Can I tell you, when you say about the woman who said, well, the other guy had allegations of sexual misconduct and so forth, harassment, it reminds me a bit of that. They used to say in the Middle East, there were all these secular dictators, often from the military, and then say, oh, they're not very good, and let's give the Islamists a chance. And the Islamists come into power, and they're much, much, much more worse. Yes, it's like, let's be frank, Iran before the Islamic Revolution of 1979 wasn't a democracy. It had the king, it had the Shah of Iran, and he was not a Democrat. But it's quite possible that his dictatorship was a touch more enlightened than the current bunch of ayatollahs who run Iran. And so I think often in the real world, you've got to make political choices between political realities. Would I like Israel's neighbors to be Jeffersonian democracies and committed to human rights and stuff? Yeah, of course I would. But is that an option? Unfortunately, sometimes I have to accept my neighbors for what they are. And if no Arab state is a democracy, at least I'd like them to be countries that want to have peace with Israel.
Yes. And by the way, where New York is concerned, you see, the only reason that this is so significant when the actual election for mayor is in November, not now. It's assumed that whoever wins the Democratic Party's primary is going to be mayor because there's no chance in hell that New York will elect a Republican.
They elected Giuliani, though. Didn't they elect Giuliani?
I know, that was Mark. You know how many? That was 2 decades ago. Okay. You say Giuliani. Yeah. Giuliani is the one example people like to bandy about. And yes, Bloomberg, and there's all kinds of talk about that. But the point that I'm saying is when you say, yeah, you look at your options, you're talking to me. I'm aware of that, but I wouldn't vote for any Democrat. So, you're talking to the wrong person. I would rather vote for a Republican box of cornflakes over any Democratic candidate for mayor, for governor, for the president. I mean, it's true. There are a couple of good Democrats I can name, but I'm telling you, it's irrelevant. When you ask me, how is that possible? It is possible because of this woke ideology that is seeped in, and it's this woke ideology has married Islamist radicalism. That's what you have to ask. How is that possible? How is someone who says, gay rights is for culture that slaughters gay people? Go figure that.
Can I tell you, I used to work for the government, as you know, and one of the positions I did for the Israeli government, I was the ambassador of Israel to the United Kingdom from 2016 to 2020. And when I was there, it was a very difficult period for the British Labour Party because a person who was accused of being anti-Semitic and having all these relationships with Islamist extremists and other extremists was the leader of the Labour Party, a man called Jeremy Corbyn. And it brought their Labour Party to an unprecedented electoral defeat. It was a failure politically because mainstream people don't like that sort of extremism. And if something similar is going to happen to the Democrats, as we've seen in New York, is that not political death for them too?
Well, that's probably why Trump won this election. You don't have to say, will it? We've seen it. We saw it with Obama. We saw it with Biden. They go too far. The things they support were outrageous. And the public, as you say, normal people have more common sense. Even ones who are not ideologues, they have common sense about good and evil and about how you live a normal life. And the Democratic Party has become so extreme that, and you say, won't that cause? Yes, of course. That's why President Trump is president. That's why he got elected.
But Ruthie, I make a distinction between someone like Starmer, who I have criticism of. I think his position on Israel has not been as the way I would like it to be. How's that for a diplomatic understatement? But I make a distinction between him and someone like Jeremy Corbyn. Just as I make a distinction between Macron, who I'm also critical of, and that radical left movement in France that's all river to the sea and so forth. And I think you can make the same distinction between someone like Biden, who we weren't happy with everything he did, obviously, and between someone like this mayor of New York or this potential mayor. There is a difference between a sort of a center-left, sort of more mainstream politician, and between someone who's on the radical river to the sea side. There is a distinction.
Mark, Biden, as we now know, wasn't actually president of the United States. It was the woke people around him dictating policy. Yeah, it's true. Biden was an old style Democrat. That's why they propped him up like a puppet to make sure that that the Democratic Party wouldn't look so radical. But you know what? I don't make a distinction anymore because Biden wasn't Biden. It was all the people around him. And so forget that. And by the way, so you're right. There's a distinction between Jeremy Corbyn and another kind of Labor Party politician. But the question is, who's around him? Whom is the candidate appeasing? And Emmanuel Macron should be ashamed of himself. He has behaved appallingly. And whether or not you say, well, you have some criticisms of him. I'm done with Macron. I don't care. I think he has no redeeming qualities.
So I think on that point of Ruthie Blum saying that Macron has no redeeming qualities, we'll have to finish this week's episode. We have come to the end of our time. Ruthie, I look forward to speaking to you again next week when we will agree on some of the issues and we will nevertheless disagree on some of the others. I wish you a good week.
Right. And one more thing. Hopefully, I will be able to be in the studio next week if El Al Airlines puts me on the flight I'm supposed to be on.
I wish you, until then,